Welcome to Pam Jammer's Regression Tales. We post new stories every week, so be sure to subscribe, like, and share to stay updated. If you'd like to support the channel, see sequels, vote on upcoming stories, or even request a custom tale, check out my Patreon. Every bit of support helps bring more magical stories to life. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Starting over small. Chapter 1, The Conversation That Changed Everything. Julian set down his PlayStation controller with a sigh, staring at the paused screen of Demon Souls. The game's dark, medieval world flickered in the dim light of his room, his unfinished challenge lingering in the air. He had nearly beaten the last boss. Just a few more attempts, and he could have figured it out. But it didn't matter. His mind wasn't in the game anymore. The clock on his old CRT television displayed 1:47 p.m. Sunday. He needed to eat. He hadn't left his room since the night before, only emerging for water. His mom would be expecting him in the kitchen. With a final glance at the TV, he turned the console off, its hum fading into silence. The house was quiet and warm, filled with the muted glow of the autumn sun filtering through the blinds. Outside, the economy was collapsing, banks failing, stores closing, people losing their jobs in waves. It was October 2008, and every news channel droned on about the financial crisis, the worst in decades. Inside, everything remained the same. The house smelled like coffee and roasted vegetables. The TV in the living room had been left on CNN, the volume low, murmuring something about job cuts and foreclosures. His mom must have been watching earlier, but she had muted it now. In the kitchen, Clara was setting down 2 plates of food. She had already prepared lunch, as she always did. She was dressed in a well-fitted knit sweater in a deep burgundy shade, the fabric soft but structured. She wore tailored slacks in a muted taupe, effortlessly put together even in her most casual moments. Her hair, dark and sleek, was pulled back into a simple but precise low ponytail. No stray hairs, no fuss. A small, understated gold watch rested on her wrist, the only piece of jewelry she ever wore at home. She looked relaxed but still composed, the kind of woman who never let herself look unprepared for anything. Julian's thought process: she always looks like she could walk into an important meeting at any second, even when she's doing something as simple as making lunch. Her expression was calm, steady, the way it always was. The only real constant in his life. She glanced up as he walked in, giving him a small, knowing smile. "I wasn't sure if you'd be coming out for lunch today." Julian pulled out a chair, lowering his gaze to the food. Roasted potatoes, chicken, steamed greens. Healthy, balanced. She had made his plate without asking, as if he were still a child. "Yeah," he muttered, picking up his fork. "Just wasn't hungry earlier." For a while, they ate in quiet. The silverware clinked softly against plates. Outside, the autumn sun shifted behind the clouds. "I know you're frustrated," Clara said finally, her voice even. "But have you thought about where you want to apply next?" Julian stiffened. He had been waiting for her to bring it up. He hadn't touched an application since he got laid off. "What's the point?" he muttered. "No one's hiring." "The right opportunity will come up," she said simply. She always spoke like that, as if things were inevitable, logical, part of a process. He set his fork down, staring at his plate. A month ago, his job had seemed secure. It wasn't much, just a retail position at a gaming store, but it had been something. A place where he knew what he was doing. Where his skills actually mattered. Then the economy crashed, people stopped spending money, and his hours got cut. One week, they told him they couldn't afford to keep everyone. He wasn't even fired for doing anything wrong, he was just unnecessary. First his job. Then Bridget. His chest tightened, and he swallowed hard. I think it's why she left," he said suddenly. Clara set her fork down neatly. She didn't ask who. She knew. His voice felt unsteady. Bridget. Last week. She stayed quiet, waiting for him to go on. She said it was because she was going to college and I wasn't. That she didn't want to be tied down. He exhaled sharply. But I think it was because I told her. Clara's brow furrowed slightly. Told her what? He let out a bitter laugh, staring down at the table. I thought I could tell her anything, he said, voice cracking. I was wrong. Clara didn't say anything, didn't push. She always waited. Julian clenched his fists under the table. His throat felt tight, his stomach twisted. He had to ask. Mom, he said quietly. Is it really true I can tell you anything? Clara tilted her head slightly. Of course, Julian. His hands were shaking. And you'll still love me? Her expression didn't change, but she reached across the table, placing a steadying hand over his. Absolutely. Julian swallowed hard, his vision blurring. I've always wanted to wear diapers. The words left his mouth like a stone dropping into water. He swallowed, forcing himself to keep going. I've always wanted to be treated like a baby. His hands trembled beneath hers. He forced himself to look up, half expecting disgust, confusion, anything. But Clara was watching him with calm understanding. It's always made me feel like a freak, he admitted, his voice breaking. Tears slipped down his face before he could stop them. He sucked in a breath, trying to wipe them away before they could fall. But it was too late. Is that why she left? He whispered. Clara didn't hesitate. She stood, moving around the table, wrapping him in her arms before he could even process what was happening. She held him tightly, protectively, like she had when he was small. You are not a freak, Julian. Her voice was firm, steady, so certain. He shook against her. If Bridget left because of that, she murmured, her voice softer now, then it's her loss. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She just held him tighter. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, letting himself fall into the comfort of her presence. For the first time in weeks, he felt safe. Clara smoothed his hair back, deep in thought. She wasn't disgusted. She wasn't shocked. She was solving a problem. Chapter 2, Understanding. Clara held Julian for a long time, letting his quiet sobs shake against her as she gently ran her fingers through his hair. His breathing was uneven, his body trembling, but she didn't let go. Not until he was ready. When he finally pulled back slightly, she kept her hands on his shoulders, studying his face. His eyes were red, his expression raw. He wasn't looking at her. Sweetheart, she said softly, brushing his damp bangs back from his forehead. I want to understand. Will you let me? Julian swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the table. He gave the smallest nod. Clara sat back in her chair, keeping her hands on his. You've always wanted this? Another nod. His fingers clenched in his lap. For as long as I can remember, he murmured. I don't know why. I just do. She squeezed his hands, reassuring. Bridget was the first person you told? His breath hitched, and he hesitated before giving another small nod. I thought she would understand, he whispered. I thought if I explained it right, it would make sense. But after I told her, she started acting different. Distant. And then she left. Clara reached up, cupping his cheek, tilting his face up just enough so he couldn't completely hide. That is her loss, Julian. Not yours. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, eyes darting downward again. He hesitated, as if expecting more questions, but Clara remained quiet, waiting for him to be ready. After a long pause, she asked, Do you want to use your diapers? His entire body stiffened. He squeezed his eyes shut and gave a single nod. For number one? Another nod, smaller this time. His face was burning. For number two? He swallowed thickly, nodding his head quickly. Clara nodded in return, keeping her voice soft and steady. Do you want to be treated like a baby? Julian hesitated, his fingers curling into fists. Then, after a painfully long pause, he gave the slightest nod. How old? Clara pressed, her tone gentle. A toddler? Younger? His voice was barely a whisper. His face was so hot he thought it might burn him from the inside out. Still in diapers. Just starting to walk. Clara exhaled softly. She reached up, brushing her fingers against his damp cheek before pulling him close again. He melted into her embrace, shaking. I love you, Julian, she murmured into his hair. That hasn't changed, and it won't. A sob racked his body, and she just held him tighter. He was fragile in this moment, and she wouldn't let him fall apart alone. She didn't say anything else, didn't rush him, didn't try to offer solutions just yet. She simply held him, running her fingers through his hair in slow, soothing strokes. But in her mind, she was already thinking. Already planning. She understood now. And if Julian needed this, if it would make him feel safe and whole again, then she would make sure he had exactly what he needed. Chapter 3, Safe and Understood. Clara guided Julian to the couch, her grip firm but gentle as she led him into the living room. He hesitated for a moment, lingering in the doorway as if uncertain whether he deserved the comfort she was offering. Without a word, she sat down and patted her lap. He swallowed, then let himself sink down onto the couch, resting his head against her legs. She began stroking his hair, slow and rhythmic, her other hand moving in soft circles across his back. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The house was a reflection of the life Clara had built: high ceilings, polished hardwood floors, and tasteful decor that blended warmth with quiet affluence. A plush cream-colored sectional wrapped around the room, accented with deep burgundy and navy throw pillows. The coffee table was glass with a sleek metal frame, and on top sat a neatly arranged stack of magazines, a few books, and a candle that had burned halfway down. A large flat-screen television was mounted above the fireplace, though it was turned off now, leaving only the muted afternoon light to fill the space. Against one wall stood a tall CD tower, neatly filled with albums, next to a high-end stereo system, a reminder of Clara's love for classical music and jazz. Julian lay still, feeling the warmth of his mother's hand move through his hair. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he had missed so much. He let his eyes drift shut, his body still trembling slightly from the emotional weight of their conversation. Clara's voice was soft when she finally spoke. Are you feeling better? Julian nodded, not trusting his voice yet. His relief was overwhelming, almost suffocating. She hadn't recoiled, hadn't looked at him differently. The secret he had carried alone for so long was now out in the open, and he wasn't being pushed away. Instead, she was comforting him. Accepting him. He felt lighter than he had in years. She continued running her fingers through his hair, waiting, thinking. Then, gently, she asked, have you ever bought diapers? Julian hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly. Then, slowly, he nodded. Several times, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded, absorbing the information. Do you have any now? Another small nod. In my room. Hidden. What about baby powder? He shook his head. Diaper rash cream? No, he mumbled. A changing mat? He shook his head again, his face burning. Clara exhaled softly. She reached up, brushing her fingers against his damp cheek before pulling him close again. He melted into her embrace, shaking. I love you, Julian, she murmured into his hair. That hasn't changed, and it won't. A sob racked his body, and she just held him tighter. He was fragile in this moment, and she wouldn't let him fall apart alone. She didn't say anything else, didn't rush him, didn't try to offer solutions just yet. She simply held him, running her fingers through his hair in slow, soothing strokes. But in her mind, she was already thinking. Already planning. She understood now. And if Julian needed this, if it would make him feel safe and whole again, then she would make sure he had exactly what he needed. Chapter 4: A Mother's Offer. Julian stirred, blinking against the soft glow of the afternoon light. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. In fact, he was surprised that he had. But the warmth of his mother's lap, the steady hum of her voice as she quietly hummed a tune, and the gentle strokes of her fingers across his back and through his hair had lulled him into a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He had been emotionally exhausted, drained from crying, from the weight of everything he had revealed. His body had simply given in. The world outside the large living room windows was calm. The suburban neighborhood stretched beyond their manicured front lawn, lined with towering oak trees that swayed in the mild October breeze. The houses were elegant, modern yet classic, spaced apart enough to provide privacy but close enough to remind them they weren't isolated. A black luxury sedan rolled smoothly down the quiet street, likely one of their neighbors heading home from a Sunday afternoon errand. The sky was a soft, pale blue with wisps of clouds, and golden sunlight glowed against the tops of the trees, signaling the slow descent into evening. Clara's fingers ran through his hair in slow, deliberate strokes. He sighed, shifting slightly, but he didn't pull away. He didn't want to. "I was thinking while you slept," she murmured. Julian swallowed, his body still heavy from the nap. He nodded against her lap, waiting. "I want you to understand something," Clara continued. "Bridget finding this overwhelming isn't a reflection of you. It doesn't mean you did something wrong." His throat tightened, but he said nothing. She exhaled softly, her fingers grazing the nape of his neck. "The truth is, this kind of thing isn't easy for most people to understand. It can be scary to learn something so deeply personal about someone you care about. That doesn't mean she was cruel. It just means she wasn't the right person for you." Julian blinked, his gaze unfocused as he stared out the window. A pair of kids rode by on bikes, their laughter faint through the thick glass. For a moment, he envied their simplicity. Clara's voice remained steady, unwavering. "But one thing I think you may not fully grasp yet is that the thought of something and the reality of it can be very different." He frowned slightly but remained quiet. "There's a difference between wanting something in theory and actually living it," she continued. "The idea of being treated like a baby may feel safe and comforting in your mind, but experiencing it fully is something else entirely." Julian's fingers curled slightly against her thigh, and she squeezed his shoulder gently. "I don't say this to scare you," she assured him. "I say it because I want you to understand what this would mean. What it would require. Not just of you, but of me." He swallowed hard, his heart pounding against his ribs. Clara shifted slightly, repositioning so that her hand lay flat against his back. "Julian, you know that ever since your father left, I've dedicated my life to you. Not just in making sure we had what we needed, but emotionally. You have always been my priority." His eyes burned again, and he squeezed them shut. "This is a problem I can help solve," Clara said, her voice softer now. "If you're willing to trust me." Julian held his breath. "I have an offer for you," she murmured. His pulse quickened, and he slowly turned his head, resting his cheek against her lap as he looked up at her. The afternoon light framed her face, making her look as serene and composed as ever. Clara gave him a small, knowing smile, her fingers moving once again through his hair. "Do you want to hear it?" Chapter 5: The First Step. Julian sat frozen on the couch, his mind struggling to keep up with the reality of what was happening. Everything had unfolded so quickly, his confession, his mother's offer, and now, her next step. Clara's voice was calm, unwavering. "Tell me exactly where they are." His throat felt dry. "In my closet. Behind some sweaters." She nodded. "Stay here. Don't get off the couch." As she stood and left the room, Julian swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed them against his lap. The air in the room felt heavier, like the walls had subtly shifted around him. His heart pounded in his chest. This was real. A moment later, Clara returned, carrying the bag of diapers in one hand. She set them down on the coffee table with a soft thud, not dramatic, not ceremonial, just a simple action. As if this were the most natural thing in the world. As if she had just brought in groceries or a stack of laundry. Julian's eyes locked onto the package. Seeing it there, out in the open, under the warm glow of the living room light, made his stomach twist. He had never seen them like this, never out in the open, never acknowledged. They had always been hidden, something secret and shameful. But Clara wasn't reacting like it was anything unusual. She wasn't staring at the bag like it was strange or wrong. She simply reached forward, unsealed the plastic, and pulled one out. "All right," she said, her voice still so steady. "Let's get you into one." Julian's breath hitched. He felt like his body wasn't responding properly, like his limbs had disconnected from his mind. "I can do it," he stammered, reaching for the diaper. His hands shook slightly as he moved, but before he could grab it, Clara gently pushed his hands away. "No," she said simply. "I'll do it." His stomach dropped. He looked up at her, wide-eyed, but she wasn't teasing, wasn't judging. Just firm. Certain. "You weren't taking care of your skin," she continued, unfolding the diaper in her hands, examining it. "No baby powder, no rash cream. That's not how it's done." She disappeared briefly into the hall and returned with a small container of baby powder. Julian recognized it instantly. It was the one she kept in her bathroom, something she used for getting out stains. It had never been meant for him, never meant for this, but now it was in her hands as she knelt beside him. "Lie back," she instructed. Slowly, he did, heart thundering as he rested against the couch. Clara reached for his shirt first, lifting it carefully over his head. He squeezed his eyes shut as she moved to his sweatpants, slipping them down with careful precision. He felt the cool air on his legs as she tugged his socks off next, leaving him bare except for his underwear. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause, she simply hooked her fingers into the waistband and slid them down, leaving him completely exposed. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He could feel his face burning, but Clara didn't acknowledge his embarrassment. Instead, she reached for the diaper, sliding it under him with practiced ease. The thick padding crinkled as she adjusted it beneath him. The sound sent shivers through his spine. Next, she reached for the baby powder, sprinkling it generously over his skin. The scent was soft, sweet, and unmistakable. Julian felt the coolness of it against him, felt the way Clara rubbed it in gently, her hands warm and steady. He was shaking now, not out of fear, but out of something he couldn't quite name. As she dusted off her hands, she murmured almost to herself, "We'll need diaper rash cream." Then, without ceremony, she pulled the front of the diaper up between his legs, smoothing it out as she brought the sides together. The thick padding pressed against him, wrapping him in something both foreign and completely familiar. She fastened the tapes, pressing them down firmly. And just like that, it was done. Clara leaned back slightly, observing her work. Then, as if discussing something as mundane as tying his shoes, she asked, "How does it feel?" Julian could barely think, let alone answer. His face was burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swallowed thickly, barely able to process what had just happened. His body felt different. Softer. More restricted, yet safe. His voice was small, unsteady. "It feels nice." Clara smiled, smoothing his hair back with her fingers. "I thought so." She glanced at the bag of diapers again, then down at him. "It's only been 6 years, you know." Julian blinked, his mind sluggish. "What?" "Since you stopped wetting the bed," she mused. "You were 12. Not so long ago." Julian's stomach twisted. His face flushed even redder, if that was possible. He couldn't believe she had said that so casually, like it was just a simple fact. Clara didn't seem to notice his flustered reaction. Or, more likely, she noticed but simply didn't care. She leaned back, resting a hand gently against his chest, her presence warm and grounding. "It's time to start," she said simply. And with that, the next step of Julian's journey began. Chapter 6, The First Major Test. Julian sat curled up on the couch, still adjusting to the thick padding now taped snugly around his waist. His mind hadn't fully caught up with everything that had happened, his mother's calm authority, the matter-of-fact way she had changed him, the sheer normalcy in her demeanor. As if this were just another Sunday afternoon chore. But when Clara spoke again, his stomach tightened. "You're going to need a babysitter." His head jerked up, eyes wide. "What?" Clara sat back, hands resting on her lap. "I have to work tomorrow. I can't leave a baby at home alone all day." His heart pounded. "No way," he said, shaking his head. "Absolutely not." Clara had expected this. She didn't argue. She simply gave him a long, steady look, not angry, not forceful, just serious, ensuring he was paying attention. "Julian," she said slowly, "this is part of it. If you were really a baby, would I leave you home alone while I went to work?" He swallowed hard. "But..." She held up a hand, silencing him. "This isn't up for debate. If you want to continue, this is part of it. Otherwise, we stop now. Forever." Julian felt his breath hitch in his throat. His hands clenched the couch cushions as he stared at her, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about this. He hadn't thought about any of the logistics. He had been so overwhelmed with relief when she accepted him, so wrapped up in the sensation of finally wearing a diaper again, that he hadn't considered the reality of what this would mean. And then his stomach sank further. If she already had someone in mind, that meant... Who? His voice was barely above a whisper. Clara's expression remained calm. "Victoria." Julian's heart stopped. His cousin. His cousin was going to see him like this. "No," he said immediately, shaking his head. "No way." Clara reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "She's in town and available. She's been looking for work, and this will help her." Julian's mind spiraled. Victoria was only a few months older than him, but she had always been more confident, more assertive, always one step ahead of him. She had a way of making everything feel like a competition, of turning even the smallest things into a game where she always won. And now she was going to be his babysitter? Clara watched him carefully, sensing the storm of emotions in his expression. She wasn't going to push him too hard. This was a test, after all. One of the biggest ones. "Julian," she said softly, squeezing his shoulder, "I need you to trust me. I would never do anything to hurt you, and neither would Victoria." Julian swallowed hard, his mind flashing through every possible reaction Victoria could have. Would she tease him? Would she act smug? Would she treat him like nothing had changed at all? He had no idea. But Clara wasn't relenting. This was the first real test. His breath shuddered. His entire body tensed. But slowly, ever so slowly, he whispered, "Okay." Clara gave a small nod of approval, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Good boy." Then, before he could even process the weight of his decision, he heard the dial tone start. The phone was ringing. It was happening. Thanks so much for watching today. We hope you enjoyed this week's story and found it relatable, enjoyable, or just a little comforting. Remember, we post new videos every week, so if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you found this helpful or know someone who might, don't forget to like the video and share it with your community. Your support means everything and helps us keep creating content just for you. And if you'd like to see sequels, vote on upcoming stories, or even get a custom tale made just for you, check out our Patreon. Every bit of support keeps the magic alive. Until next time, take care and stay true to yourself.